They called her just the help, long enough that the name stuck like dust in her hair. Folks in Miller's Bend said it as if it were a fact, something simple and settled. They said it over coffee in the mornings, the sound of their words small and satisfied as the kettle sang on the stove. They said it under lamplight when the men leaned back in their chairs and the preacher's wife smoothed her cuffs. They said it across the bar where the stagecoach's wheels left circles of mud on the floor. They said it loud enough for her to hear, and softer when they thought she wasn't listening. Liza Hart kept her head down and kept moving. That was how she had been taught. Work, keep the stove hot, the cups filled, and the horses tied. Do not make a scene. Do not ask for anything you do not already owe. Keep the hurt where it belongs, under the bones, under the sleeves. Miller's Bend rested like a coin on the open plain, half buried in a wash of golden grasses and sunburnt earth. There were the usual markers of a town that had been carved out of plains and stubbornness. A narrow main street of packed dirt, a general store with a bell that never stopped ringing, a church with a steeple that tried to catch the moon, and a saloon called the Iron Horse whose door creaked in a way that sounded like gossip and carried the smell of whiskey and pipe tobacco for 2 blocks. The saloon belonged to a man with a suit sharp as a tailor's knife and a patience as thin as his ledger. He took in trade and judgment both, and in the evening his ledger's pages were full with other people's reckonings. Inside, the lamplight warmed the room in wide, lazy breaths. Shadow and brass and the low hum of a piano where a man with fingers like blunt knives kept time for people who wanted to forget. Liza worked at the Iron Horse, not by birthright, not by pride, but by the plain force of morning necessity. She woke before the sun, as she always had, and would feed the small stove a bite of coal and see the kettle begin to speak. She would stand at the back door where the world leaned in, wind that smelled like sage and dust and horses, and roll cloths with hands steady from years of mending not just shirts but the seams of a life. Her hands were calloused and the palms carried the faint whiteness where a ring had once rested. People noticed the hands before they noticed her face. Calloused, they would say, and there was a certain reverence to the word. Her face was plain, not pretty in the way of the paper dolls they fanned at dances, but honest. Her jaw was strong, the kind that could hold a stubborn mouth shut. Her eyes were the slow gray of prairie skies before storm, and they said more than she ever let voice claim. She kept her softness folded tight, like a letter you didn't want to lose when the wind got strong. She wore plain dresses, washed and mended until the seams knew every contour of her and fit like a promise. Her hair was brown and pinned up at the nape of her neck, always tucked away from the dishes and the wayward smoke. She was neither tall nor short but had a posture that suggested a woman who had carried weight and did not expect applause for the doing. Folks in town had given her nicknames that changed with the seasons. The Widow, the Hand, that Heart Girl. They meant something in each mouth without meaning everything. Liza let them. She had learned the part some years ago when a man named Tom Hart had left a wind and a shadow where he had been. Sometimes, when the night inside the Iron Horse got too thick, she would press her palm to the hollow at her collarbone and count the quiet where his laugh had lived. She would not call it grief, not anymore. She would call it a ledger of sorts. Lines of memory tucked among other worn things. The town's small cruelties unnamed themselves into polite phrases. Mercy came wrapped in sermon and scold. Jeanette Price, the preacher's wife, had a mouth like a doorstop. It closed and opened on other people's sins. Jeanette liked to stand by the saloon's outer edge and make small judgments into fashion. She'd do better to take up a better bonnet, Jeanette liked to say, loud enough for a room to catch the sentence. A plain woman shouldn't try to be plain without the proper means. The men would laugh, the kind of laugh that spreads like moth wings, and someone would add a song about patience and the way the town believed in keeping to its place. But there were other voices too, quieter ones. A boy named Eli who washed glasses and kept watch over the horses would sometimes hand Liza an extra biscuit, his freckled face earnest like a prayer. Old Mrs. Burrows, who kept a rooming house behind the bakery, would lean over and say, "Child, you've got the best manners of anyone I know. Keep them." The town's scorn and kindness braided together like the rope the cowboys leaned on. Rough and useful both. It was on a late summer evening that everything particular and small started to tilt. The sky had been a hard blue all afternoon, sun hammering the town into thin, bright lines. By supper time, a wind came up that smelled of rain on the far horizon, and the grasses began to press whispering hands against the windows. People gathered at the Iron Horse as if drawn by rumor. The saloon had a hum to it, poker chips clinking, the piano steady, honest scrapes, the crack of a new deck when someone thought gambling suited a bad mood. Liza moved between the tables with a tin tray that held coffee cups like tiny, steaming lamps. Her steps were steady. She balanced the tray as if everything would fall if she stopped. She had learned years ago that stopping was a dangerous thing in Miller's Bend. People waited for you to falter and then they would step. The man who entered that evening had the sort of arrival that made folks look up all at once. He rode slow, his horse's hooves tapping like a metronome that kept the world from tumbling. He wore a hat pulled down low, the brim casting his face into shadow. He had a coat that had been mended in more than one place and boots that had a dark callus on the right heel, the sort of asymmetry that tells you a man had once been a long way from home. When he dismounted, he moved with the economy of someone who only used what he needed. No boast, no flair, just habit of efficiency. He tied the horse to a post and stood back like a man who had learned to observe a room before he found his place in it. There was an air about him that set him apart from the weathered ranchers and the slick drifters. He had shoulders that suggested the kind of work done out of necessity, not show. His face was bronzed and the line at his jaw had a memory of battles. A nose a little crooked, a scar by the temple that told a story he didn't plan to speak aloud. His eyes were the color of burned sage, with flecks of something iron and inevitable in them. He looked around as if gauging the town for a map only he had read, and when his eyes landed on Liza, the room, for a moment, sized itself smaller. She felt it like a stone dropped in a pond. The eddies of attention washed around her and she kept moving. "Evening," he said to no one in particular, and yet his voice cut through the piano's scrape as though it belonged over it. He removed his hat by habit and hung it on the rail beside the door, his hands leaving a scent of leather and the kind of grease that comes from saddles and travel. By the time he called for coffee, Liza had already set a cup on the table beside his elbow, the steam threading into the light like a small promise. She did not look up when he first spoke. She did not look up because she was meant to keep the world turning, the way the oven kept its glow. That was what her hands were for, to keep the rhythm steady, to make sure pots did not boil over and that someone else's evening did not spill into ruin. But when he spoke again, quieter this time, she allowed herself a glance. He said, as if naming a truth that had been held back by the room, "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone." The man who said that had a soft smile that did not try to charm, but was light enough for Liza to catch. She felt it the way you feel rain before it comes, a shift of pressure in the chest. She blinked and set the tin tray down more carefully than she would have liked, and the coffee cups murmured against the saucers. There was something in the man's voice that felt like a touchstone to her. He noticed without making it a thing. He noticed, and in a town that made a trade of seeing people's faults, that felt like a kind of grace. Her name was Liza Hart, and she had never been the kind to enjoy compliments. They were like bright coins that could blind if you held them too close. So she gave a small nod and kept moving. She wrapped a cloth around the handle of a skillet, her fingers working with the silent, practiced choreography of a woman who had spent her life making hearths hold. He watched her do it in a way that did not pry. He watched as you might watch a storm, not to wreck it, but to witness the pattern. He came back the next night and the next, sometimes early, sometimes late. He had a way of saying very little and being present like a thing that did not take much space but changed what it rested near. Liza found herself looking for the steadiness of his chair at the bar the way one looks for a shoreline when the sea begins to pull at everything. His name was Jacob McCree. The town had called him by other names. He had a past with borders and barbed wire, but when he sat at that bar and drank his coffee, he used none of them. He ordered simple food, told no long stories, and when he spoke, men listened like they were being taught something without a book. There were nights when the room filled with sound and his presence was simply part of it. There were nights when the talk at the tables turned unkind, and Jeanette Price would let a word slip that made a room still. "You know where she came from, don't you?" Jeanette would sputter at the chorus of the poker players, big eyes fierce, hair like a halo. No right to be polite when her kind has a past. The town loved the theater of gossip because it let them step away from the small daily things they had to do to survive. It cost nothing to judge, and they spent their coin on the guilty like a sport. When Liza laughed, which she did sometimes when the piano hit a note that made the room lighter, the laugh was simple and not loud. It did not chide, it did not call for attention. It was the laugh of someone who had found a small mercy in the company of other people. Jacob McCree heard it and turned his head, and the way his mouth eased felt like an answer to something she hadn't known to ask. He would sometimes rise and fetch her a towel or a pot of water without making it performative. He would move like a man who considered duty, not show. Those small, steady acts stacked up in her chest like kindling. Miller's Bend liked to keep its stories neat. Preferred origin tales with crisp edges. Liza had fit into none of those tidy slots for a long time. She had been widowed, yes, once from a man who loved the land like a religion, and who left in a way that pressed a dark bruise into the middle of her life. She had kept on working, not out of defiance but because the bed had to be made and the kettle had to be boiled. People liked to talk about her marriage as though it were a sealed chapter where blame lived. It wasn't as simple, and Liza had learned that complications were a luxury the town could not afford. When the subject came up, whispers called it closure, and she nodded along because there was no profit in arguing. Then one afternoon, before the sky had the time to think of evening, a child with a face full of freckles came stumbling into the Iron Horse, her dress torn and her eyes two bright, worried bottoms of storm. She clutched a small bundle to her chest as if it were a new world and everyone else had been ghosted. Her name was Maggie, and she came from a farm a few miles out where her mother had taken ill. She had walked through the heat and the bluster because there was no one else to ask. Liza saw the child before anyone else in the room seemed to. She saw the way her shoulders curved, the way the dust on the hem mapped the story of the last hour. She put down her tray and wiped her hands on her apron without asking. "You come in, child," she said quietly, kneeling to see Maggie's face more clearly. Maggie's breath was fast and she could not make the words come steady. "My ma's bad," she said, the sentence like a small plate cracking on the floor. "She's got fever and the fever's high. They say a doctor'll cost too much and the folks are gone and I can't." Her voice shook and a salt line made tracks down to her chin. The bundle in her arms unwrapped a rag of bread and a bit of cloth, a measure of what had been scraped together. Liza did not look up at the room. She did not wait for permission. She scooped up a pot, went into the back, and began to measure and mend not only the child's hunger but the hole where no one had stepped forward. She topped up the pot with water and boiled what little medicine Mrs. Burrows had left in an old jar. She chopped a scrap of beef, seasoned it with a hand that had been taught to make miracles of small things, and warmed 2 biscuits until their edges were the shade of the town's porches. The room had its various reactions. Some men grunted in the way that meant approval for showing mercy if it was clearly directed toward some entertainment. Jeanette Price made a sour, measured noise, as if kindness needed to come with a receipt. A few of the regulars pretended not to watch. Jacob McCree simply set his cup down and watched Liza with the sort of attention that made the rest of the room feel like it was being seen through a fine lens. When Liza returned, balancing plates and a steaming mug, Maggie's whole body seemed to unclench. The child sat down and began to eat like a woman who had expected to wait a long time for bread, but finally found it in hand. Liza sat across the table, her skirt brushing her knees, and refused to let anyone turn charity into spectacle. She did not announce what she had done. She did not ask for praise. She merely poured a cup of coffee and offered a cloth to wipe the child's face. The quiet kindness of it struck a few people like thunder, struck Jacob like a bell. He rose then, without theatrics, and walked to the door to see if the horse's reins were loose or if someone needed conversation. He came back and left a coin on the table for the child's mother. It was not money aimed at making people nod. It was a gesture as spare and private as a folded map. The kind things built between them, silent as made nests. Jacob left small notes on the bar some mornings. Sacks of flour bought and left without comment. A length of rope that Liza had once mentioned she needed. He would sometimes leave the saddle at the innkeeper's for repair and sign no name. The town speculated because towns run on speculation when there's nothing else to do. Jeanette's tongue sharpened with it, cutting at Liza's soft edges until the woman folded inward with the same small, habitual dignity that had always kept her safe. Liza's life sharpened into a rhythm she had long thought would simply go on. She woke, made coffee, fed the small stove, and served. She listened to the town's habits and let them roll over her like a tide she could not quite repel. Jacob's presence flitted like a bird in the corner of her life, steadying without pressing. He never asked questions about the past. He never pressed for details about the number of meals she'd lived on. He simply sat and watched her work, like a man keeping inventory not of things but of small mercies. Then, as happens in towns where people believe they have the right to arrange other people's lives into tidy patterns, Jeanette Price decided to make an example. The reason was trivial. A new bonnet arrived at the Price house that Jeanette suspected had cost more than her weekly allowance. She could have kept her head and mind, content to mind the church's Sunday readings and the ways of righteousness. But Jeanette liked the sound of her own verdicts, and a spectacle, a public one, would polish her righteousness like a brass coin. It was a Sunday visitation, after the sermon had been digested into the pockets of people's days. Jeanette took Liza's path by design. She swept into the iron horse as if it were a sermon pulpit, head held high, gloves tight over the small, vengeful fingers that like to make a point. The church bell still rang in the background, and the room had the steely, holy hush that always follows a judgment. Jeanette chose her target and did not bother disguising a barb as conversation. "Liza Hart," she said, the syllables folded with the heavy ribbon of small-town meaning. "I saw you yesterday in a new bonnet." The words were not a question. Questions would have given Liza space. Instead, they were a headline. The room had a particular habit of turning its face toward any drama. The poker players straightened. The bar's glass took on a quieter ring. The town liked a simple story with clear ends, and public shaming was as much a staple as steak in some kitchens. Liza felt the prick of 100 eyes like needles along her spine. She could have defended herself. She could have said she'd bought the bonnet with saved coin, with labor turned into currency for the sake of small dignity. She could have said anything. But the town did not want the complexity of truth. It wanted the ease of a target. Liza had learned to keep her voice from becoming a weapon. Her silence was both a covenant and a defense. She would not tremble for the pleasure of strangers. "I wear what I have," she said at last, in a voice like a low bell. She kept her chin level the way one shelters a raw thing. She had been taught that a woman's pride was something you kept like a coin in a safe place. Her reply was not loud, but the room heard it like a strike. Jeanette made a show of victory anyway. "And is that what you wear, ma'am? To appear fancy, when folk know you of all people ought to be plain and humble." The words were a thud. Psalm and accusation folded into one. The room laughed, the cruel kind, and Liza felt the air pull from her chest. She did not show the way she inhaled again. She kept moving because that was what she did best, go on. She poured drinks for the men, cracked a whip-crack of laughter that belonged to another table, and let their voices wash over the skin of her life like a wind that meant to buff her down into hollowness. Jacob watched, and in his eyes a storm began to gather. He had been careful about getting involved. He had been careful because his own past was the size of a barn door, and he had no wish to drag his own ghosts into the lane of other people's small cruelties. But where some men would have done nothing or would have done too much with the heels of their boots and the weight of a punch, Jacob's reaction was quiet and measured. He set down his cup and rose. His hands did not shake. His voice was low when he spoke, the voice of a man who once worked at the edges of law and because of that had learned that sometimes you used the law and sometimes you used a steady hand. "Jeanette," he said, and no one noticed how his fingers moved to the brim of his hat, as if the simple action was meant to do away with the room's heat. "You don't need to be God's sheriff when it suits you." Jeanette's face flared with the surprise of being interrupted mid-judgment. The room blinked. Jeanette did not take well to an interruption, especially one that belonged to a man with the kind of presence that carried its own authority. She squared her shoulders as if she would clap back with scripture. "I speak for the church," she said, rigid and certain. "We have our standards." Jacob did not quarrel with prayer. He simply set the weight of his gaze on the room. "Standards ain't the same as cruelty," he said. "Folks in this town got small enough lives that they use other people's missteps as mirror to make themselves look bigger. Doesn't make it right." The men at the table muttered. Jeanette's pride affords herself a rejoinder and then found herself with no company for it. Jacob's small, deep fury was like a winter wind. It did not shout, but it cut through. For the first time in a long time, the sounds in the Iron Horse began to sound like a room that had been gutted and lit anew. Liza watched, and for the first time since she had learned that silence can be both shield and cage, she understood how much she had been taught to carry alone. Jeanette, however, would not let go. She straightened and made the kind of attack that a scorned woman in a small town strings into a sermon. "And what do you know of it, Mr. McCree?" she said, the challenge a sharp, brittle thing. "You ride in and make yourself a mystery, and then you counsel like you're a saint." Jacob's jaw tightened. He could have answered in the way of men with pasts, words like holster and law or a threat or a clatter of stories, but he did not. He touched his hat and his voice was a low drawl. "I know what I see," he said. "I seen a woman who works. She looks after children with hands stronger than most. I seen a woman who does right by her neighbors even when they hide behind sermons. That's the measure I judge by." The room fell into a hush that was almost reverent. The men's reproof was the kind that circles back on itself. Jeanette's face had the faintest flush of shame. Not the bitter, repentant kind, but the one that tells you your tools of control are slipping. The men quietly returned to their drinks. Liza stood there steady, feeling the weight of the world shift by inches. Her cheeks did something she had not taught herself to do. They warmed. It was not a victory grin that she allowed. It was the small light of being seen by someone who did not need to tear you down to understand you. Jacob's words settled like a blanket over her shoulders. She took them on, not because they changed what the town believed, but because they changed the atmosphere around the small, private thing that she guarded. The right to be unremarkable and not punished for it. After that night, people in Miller's Bend began to regard the two of them differently. Not in grand, obvious ways. The town seldom allowed for that sort of transformation, but in the subtle tilt of heads and the new, uncomfortable silence that fell when Jeanette tried to press a rumor into the room. Jacob did not become a champion of the downtrodden. He remained a man of few words and fewer gestures. But he would stand in the saloon with his back to the bar and watch Jeanette's barbs die like old embers. It was enough to rattle the town because the town relied on cruelty like sanctified wood. It was a slow fire, this change. Liza felt the warmth of it and also the tension. People who thrived on the small spoils of scorn do not disappear simply because someone new says something true. They bud against their own justice like a weed, protective of their right to judge. The town had a way of making you think you'd better not try to make a life in it if you pried too much at its seams. Liza felt that tug with the same old muscles she had used to hold herself steady through things loss had marked on her. There were nights when the wind outside seemed to be in league with the house. Sheets clattered on lines in the dark beyond the saloon, and there was a sound of wind that pressed like breath on the building's bones. One such night, Liza stayed late to close the bar. Her hands moved mechanically with the covers, the broom sweep, the racking of chairs. Her mind was on small things, the way the kettle needed a new handle, the grocery list that would be her companion the next day, when there was a knock at the back door. She opened it because she always did. It was the habit of living by light and the facts of human kindness to answer a knock. Jacob McCree stood there, his hat off and his hair mussed by the wind. He wore his coat despite the night warmth, as though habit had grown into armor. He looked as if he'd been out for a long ride. There was dust on the hem of his trousers like a map of the day. "You all right?" he asked, voice low in the hush of closing time. Liza hesitated. There is a peculiar intimacy to the late hours. No one was listening. The door's light made a small circle around them. "I'm fine," she said. She kept the truth tidy. She had long learned that to speak of the twisting ache that lived inside was to invite a crowd. She had grown used to holding her moments like secret feathers. He leaned his hip against the doorframe in the sort of way that made him look like he might be planning to stay. He did not. He simply looked at her with the honest attention of someone who had learned to shoulder a load and then offer to share it. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. It was not meant to be a sermon. It was a statement, simple and kind. She had no answer at first. Her mouth, trained to fit the shape of quiet, struggled with the warmth in her chest. "I don't have much choice," she said finally, the sentence a quiet armor. "You got more choices than you know," he said. "Sometimes people just need to be told." He paused and the lantern inside shimmered, making the world feel older and honest. Folks in this town got a way of thinking their stories decide other folks' fates. Don't let them write yours. His words were not dramatic. They were straightforward, like someone handing you a spare shirt when you were wet from the rain. Liza took them in and felt something shift like soil underfoot. Not monstrous, but something that made her aware of the small edges of her life. The way she refrained, the way she swallowed. For weeks after that, she found herself taking measures she had not allowed before. She wore her gray dress with a small new hem she'd sewn, and that seemed like a fortifying change. Jacob would smile, small and steady, when he saw her. Their exchanges were never grand. They were like two people who had been taught to measure out their lives in cups and not in barrels. Deliberate, small, and surprisingly tender. He started staying a little longer after the wheel of the mill stilled. The saloon's lamplight made his features yield like metal to heat. They would sit by the counter and sometimes he would tell her about a place he'd passed years ago where the river ran in a way that made the grass silver. He spoke sparingly, but when he spoke he used a kind of truth that had nothing to prove. Liza found herself listening as if his words were the one thing that could keep her steady. One autumn night, as the leaves that dared to exist in Miller's Bend were beginning to slip from the trees like old promises, the town learned the shape of its cruelty too well. There was a cattle drive rolling through a few miles out, men with faces stretched thin by sun, and a string of horses that looked like they'd been painted by tired hands. With cattle came manners, and with manners came the rougher edges of human reckoning. It is strange how a town can change its mood on the tip of a passing herd. The men who rode into town wore the kind of swagger that smelled like distant lawlessness. They were the sort of company that liked to test a town to see which stones wanted to be turned. They were loud, and they were not the kind of people who made small places feel safe. They liked to test edges. One of them happened to remember seeing Liza a week before, wearing that same gray dress with a new hem. They called her a whore, a cattle call's favorite cruel joke, and the word rolled through the iron horse like a stone tossed into glass. Liza could feel its impact even though she had her back to the room. The sound had the power to make blood step outside the skin for a second and look around. She did not answer. She would not because it had never helped. She poured drinks and took orders and chewed the inside of her lip until a quiet white dot bloomed. Someone at the far table barked a laugh and another threw an insult for sport. The room's air thickened with the smoke of 1,000 small cruelties. Jeanette, who had no truck with public brawls unless they were launched in the name of righteousness, sat with a small, self-satisfied smirk. Jacob rose then.
No theatrics. No flairist.
He walked straight to the center of the room and stood in front of the men who had spoken. His presence was a wall made of a man's silent promise. "You callin' names in my town?" he said, low and steady. His fingers closed on the back of a chair, and the room felt as if it had reached for a tablecloth and not found it. The man who had spoken up sneered like a wild dog and hopped to his feet. "And what of it?" he said, the bravado as loud as a bell. "Who made you judge, stranger?" Jacob's jaw was a compact thing, a magnet for quiet storms. "Nobody," he said. "But I'll tell you this, you don't go around calling women that in a place where you're just passing through and expect folks to let it be. That's the measure of a man." Words could have been fists then, which is to say words were already a kind of currency in Miller's Bend. The cattleman stepped forward like he might throw one, and a hush fell so complete that the piano stopped mid-note as if surprised. Then the stranger shoved, and Jacob did not move like the sort of man to back down. He did not move like a man eager for a fight either. He moved like a man who had been priced on the wrong side of justice too many times to let it continue. They clattered to the floor, and for a moment the saloon lost its hum. Men yelled and a chair cracked. Liza did not have to choose whether to step into the middle. She had been taught that there is a moment when a woman can step forward and make the difference between a room falling apart and a room becoming something else. She grabbed the nearest man by the sleeves and wrenched him out from under the fight, and for a second her hands were the mediators of the floor. Jacob wrestled the other man not with a show of brute strength but with a kind of control that made the man's fire sputter. No one else seemed to remember how to intervene the way she did. The fight ended with Jacob's hand on the man's collar and the man's shame clear as a bruise. The cattleman left with a parting sneer and a promise to return. The kind of promise that makes a town hold its breath for the next night. When the dust settled, the room was a map of small things. Knocked over chairs, a sainted pipe ripped in two, and a silence that felt oddly sacred. Liza's apron was smeared with a dark patch from where a man's elbow had landed. She had scraped a knuckle and the skin was split and red. Her chest felt like the inside of a bone, hollow and sensitive. Jacob straightened and looked at her with an intensity that undid a careful fold of reserve she had kept in place for years. "You all right?" he asked, because he did not know any other way to say something useful. He could have asked with a hand. Instead he asked with a question that carried the weight of the thing he'd already done. She looked at her bloody knuckles and then at him. "I'll be fine," she said. But when she said it, the sound was not sterile. It had a thread of iron in it. "I always am." He stepped back like someone recognizing something sacramental. "You don't have to be," he said. The days after the fight carried a different tone. People in Miller's Bend had a habit of measuring courage as though it were a commodity to be weighed. Jacob's act unbalanced a ledger they had kept very tidy for themselves. He had not simply defended Liza, he had defended what he saw as decency, and in doing so he had made their small cruelties look like the petty things they were. Some folks were grateful. Others took the fight as an invitation to test limits. Jeanette stewed and the cattleman found reasons to sniff around the margins of town. Liza, in the middle of it all, felt both exposed and unnaturally seen. The town had a way of making visibility into a kind of punishment, especially for women who were not meant to be noticed. There was one night, weeks later, when the danger became a thing that could no longer be prettified. Jacob came into the saloon and found Liza wiping down the bar with hands that had the memory of work in their lines. He took a seat and they talked in the shorter sentences they used when the world pressed too close. He had the look of a man who had thought about leaving and hadn't because the reason to stay had roots he'd only just begun to recognize. "Think about going away," he said suddenly, the voice more urgent than his usual calm. The words were like a stone in his mouth. "Somewhere quiet, far from men who ride rough and a town that thinks itself holy." She looked at him with the same plain expression that had kept her life together through a million small losses. "And what of Miller's Bend?" she asked. "Who would keep the kettle on for the men that come in with no sense of home?" He paused. "You know I ain't asking you to leave for me," he said, the admission small and luminous. "I'm saying you don't have to take their slings. If I could, I'd take 'em myself. Don't think it's cowardice." Liza's eyes flicked to the door and back. "Doesn't that change anything?" she asked. "That you'd take it for me?" "It changes everything," he said. He looked at her as if cataloging the shape of something he might someday hold. For a moment there was quiet between them that resembled a silence they'd both chosen. It did not lean toward romance in the explosive, fevered sense. It leaned toward a slow recognition, a kind of promise not shouted but more useful, that someone would be at your shoulder to take the wind when it gusted strong. They did not, at first, speak of the past. Jacob's past was a rumor that wandered into town on its own. A man who had once been on the wrong side of the law, a man who had lived long enough with the facts to know the truth of them. He had once been a driver of change and death and had left like a man who needed to give himself a second skin. He had been in fights and in places where the alphabet of survival was written with bones and sweat. He wore his history like a private weather. He did not broadcast it because the world rarely needed more of such stories. It needed fewer. But there were nights when the air grew thin and he would throw back a memory like a coin to test its weight. Liza would not pry. She had been given enough history of her own to know that some things we keep because to expose them would be to invite the town to scavenge. One late evening, the sort that smelled of coming winter, sharp and full of small, biting things, Liza and Jacob found themselves on the porch just after the saloon had shut its doors. The lantern light threw long, timid shadows and the stars were clear as pinpricks. There was something honest in the dark. It did not pretend. They sat in chairs that had been made to bear long winters and each other's quiet. She curled her hands in her lap the way she always did when a feeling threatened to spill. "Why do you stay?" she asked. "Because some questions are small as a keyhole and some are like a knock that must be answered." He folded his fingers and leaned forward like a man who wanted to be understood without too many words. "Because I've seen what it is to leave," he said. "And I've seen what it is to come back and find everything changed. I left my own mess in a place I couldn't fix, and so I figure I come where I'm needed." Liza's voice barely rose. "You could come back for different reasons." "I could," he said, and then he let out a soft, brief laugh. "But I didn't figure it wise to bet a life on the luck of a town treating you right." The wind slipped along the eaves like a thoughtful thing. For a long time they said nothing. The silence between them had the sort of weight that belongs in churches and near graves. Sometimes not speaking is a way of holding sacred ground. Then, as if a decision finally brought itself forth, Jacob reached into his coat and pulled a small leather bundle from his pocket. He unfolded it like someone who had been carrying a folded map for a long time. Inside was a photograph, small and worn around its edges, of a woman with a similar jaw to Liza's and a child whose hair was the color of dried hay. He did not make a speech. He held out the picture as if offering a small fact. Liza took it, clutching it like an artifact. The photograph told more than the soft sound of his voice ever could. "That's my sister and my boy," he said, without elaboration. The image was a chapter left open. He had a man's way of keeping things half-told. Liza studied the faces in the faded photograph as if the paper might give up more secrets if she pressed it close. "You got a family," she said quietly, more as a statement than a question. He nodded. "I had to leave them for reasons I'm too ashamed to give loud. But it's why I don't make much of my days. I ride, I work, I keep quiet about who I was. Sometimes it's best to be that way." Liza's hands tightened on the photograph until the paper puckered. Her fingers knew the kind of pain that asked you to bury things or let them find air. "You have no idea how I understand that," she said. "I lost a man. I learned a way to keep moving so the sound of absence didn't drown me." He looked at her then with a gaze that was 2 parts question and 1 part invitation. "So tell me then," he said. "Tell me something that didn't make you small." Liza looked at him as if deciding whether to pick up a hot coal. She tasted words that had been wrapped in cotton for years. The way she'd once stood at a field with Tom and watched the sun as if it were a sovereign magistrate. The way a lullaby had been more of prayer than song. She chose something smaller. A memory of standing under a rainstorm once, soaking to the bone but laughing with someone who had made the house feel like a home. "I married for a reason I thought was right," she said finally. "Not because the town told me to, but because it felt like something to hold. The man I married. He taught me how to plant beans in the right rows and how to believe a good day could exist again." Jacob nodded as if absorbed. "And was it worth it?" he asked, his voice small like an ember. She studied the stars as if they were brittle and would shatter if asked to move. "It was worth everything I learned," she said. "Lesson worth learning, even if the man left." He reached then and lightly took the photograph back, folding it with the care of someone who knew the right angle of grief. "There's a lot of people in this world who don't get second chances," he said. "I got one when I came here, and maybe I'm not the sort to preach about that, but I'm the sort to keep my hands free to help." That night, beneath the flash of lantern and the hush of the stars, something forged between them that has no name but demands a lot of small actions. It was less the dramatic clutch of a fevered romance and more the slow, steady building of a wall against the cold. They began to share chores in a way that looked like ordinary cooperation. Jacob fixed a leak in the roof Liza had been letting get worse because, like many of them, she had priorities and small wages. Liza, in turn, mended the cuffs of his coat as if she was stitching the man back into the world. But people who live on the edge of cruelty never stop for the comforts of two hearts finding a rhythm. Jeanette was still Jeanette, and one night she found the courage to press a rumor into the town's veins that went beyond bonnet talk. She claimed, with a smile as polished as a nail, that Jacob McCree was an outlaw who'd come to town to hide. Few challenged her. Towns loved clean stories with villains stitched in a regular pattern. Only this time, the story carried a threat of ruin. If the man was an outlaw, then any mercy he had shown the town was a bargain placed on dishonest terms. Jacob did not deny it. He had lived at the edges of law and therefore knew the taste of a man being called to account. Denials in such matters do not always land. Sometimes truth is less important than fear. He had skeletons, yes, but they were his and his alone to carry. He had been on the wrong side of war and law at times when what seemed like justice at the moment was not as carefully considered as one would hope. He had done things he did not pretend did not happen. He had come home and found his family changed by absence, a shadow he could not mend by confessing. Jeanette's rumor spread like a field fire, and for a while the town looked at him through the lens of fear. Men who had once nodded at his presence now watched him as if poised for the betrayal. A man's life reduced to a single accusation is common in towns that are fond of easy endings. Jacob felt the world tighten, and for a time there was the sort of silence that is sharper than scorn. He had a choice: to ride away and leave someone he'd come to care for, or to stay and face whatever might come. He stayed. The test of his commitment came unexpectedly and in the cruelest form. A night when the cattlemen returned, this time with a plan that smelled of a trap. They found an ally nearby in a man with a score to settle. Someone who had been wronged by Jacob in another life and who carried a memory like a loaded gun. Miller's Bend braced itself for the sort of viciousness that can spill from one person's rage into many other people's pain. They intended to make Jacob the center of a drama that would justify any small cruelty they wanted to practice. They came into the Iron Horse as a pack of shadows. The men were louder, their cruel jests shaped by anger. Jeanette, who had doubled down on her gossip like someone who had found a platform and was not going to return it, smirked in the corner as if her worst prophecies had a way of becoming currency. The cattlemen made accusations, and when they did, the room's light turned cold as a blade. They said Jacob was a thief. They said he had blood on his hands. They wanted him out, and they had a plan to get what they wanted. They didn't expect anyone to fight for him. Or if they did, they expected only a token, something to make the story more entertaining. They did not expect Liza's hand to clamp on Jacob's sleeve like a tether. "You don't get to drag someone's life across the board for your pleasure," she said, voice steady as a metronome. She had not planned to make herself central to anything, but the moment required a person willing to be small and brave at once. A man laughed and a bottle slipped, and there was a shove and the sort of noise that belongs to a place where men have been trained in roughness. Jacob moved in to defuse a hand that aimed to strike, and in that instant the room grew still enough to hear hearts. He did not strike back. He turned the man's fury into a grasp he could control, and in that movement the town saw not an outlaw but a man who had learned to survive without making spectacle. The cattlemen then felt the night close in and chose, instead of a brawl to ruin everything, to make a different kind of threat. They would lay a charge of law. They would have Sheriff Keene fetch their claim, and the sheriff, being a small man with a taste for easy ends, would carry it out. There was a plan to drag Jacob through the public seam of procedure and make him look like a monster in the light of law. The town's whisper line turned into a jury of opinions. Jacob's past, once a rumor, became a case. People in Miller's Bend were quick to sign their names to a pre-written verdict. The harder thing for Liza and Jacob was the way the town turned on itself, searching for safety in the act of exiling a man to the margins because their own security seemed threatened. It came to a head in a public square where Sheriff Keene had a habit of making a spectacle out of arrest. The sheriff had a cloak of righteousness that only needed a press to stir. He marched forth dressed in sober leather and a badge that he polished like a mirror. He called for the townsfolk to witness. Jeanette had a righteous look on her face, as if the saint herself had descended and left Jeanette as her earthly voice. The cattlemen stood proud as lions in a parade, and the room settled to watch the show. Jacob stood in the center of it, flanked by nothing but his hat and the set of his shoulders, which had, over weeks, become a kind of argument against cowardice. He did not flinch. Liza stood behind him like the shore behind a storm-tossed boat. There was no dramatic confession, no last-minute heroics. There was only the slow grinding of the town's gears and the truth, which, as often happens, was not large and dramatic but small and stubborn. Jacob McCree, Sheriff Keene read aloud from a paper that looked like an invitation to doom. You are charged with theft, assault, and harboring an accused man. The sheriff's words were measured like an indictment. Jacob listened with the plain patience of a man who had been pushed into accounts before. He looked at Liza, whose hand found his as if it were a rope tossed across a canyon. She squeezed with the sort of small, steady promise that makes the enemy step back. Then Jacob raised his head and spoke, but not in the way the town expected. Is this what you want, people? He asked, the voice carrying to the edges of the crowd. To make a man's life the currency for your comfort? To turn law into a sword you swing to make yourselves clean? The townsfolk mumbled in a chorus of uncertain noises. Some looked uncomfortable. Even Jeanette's jaw had a tremor of uncertainty, and the cattlemen gripped their reins. But people in the crowd were used to the performance of their moral indignation. The sheriff looked as though he had always expected to be the hand that made the call. He barked a command for restraint and then, as if remembering that he needed witnesses, read the warrant aloud. The evidence was thin, at least in the way of a legal paper. It thrummed with bad intention more than fact. Jacob didn't make a show. He simply placed the photograph of his family on the sheriff's table and looked the sheriff in the eye. You want to drag me through because it makes you feel righteous. But I ain't no marauder by habit. I made mistakes. I paid for many of them. But I won't let you make a man into something he isn't for your sake. The crowd did not yet know what to do with the words. They had practiced being cruel so long they had a rhythm to it. Then something happened that shifted the gravitational pull of the square a degree to the left. Liza stepped forward. Not a huge motion. Her movement was a tiny inch of will. It was the sort of inch that gets remembered not because it was loud but because it was steady. You can try to make him into whatever you please, she said, and the voice that came from her was like a bell being struck in some deep well. You can sign papers and call for jail, and the sheriff can stand as your branding iron. But hear me when I tell you this. The man you see is not the monster you make him to be. I have watched him. He does for this town what I do. He keeps things from falling apart. He stands when men like to scatter. He takes the punch so the rest of us don't. You all can talk of law and justice and righteous kills, but I know what he is. He's a kind of good that don't want praise. Her words were a small flaying of the town's veils. They made people look at themselves the way one might look in a mirror after having painted a lie across it yourself. The cattlemen's faces hardened. Jeanette's hands were the same hands that had woven other people's fault into sermon. She found herself making a small, fragile argument, but the momentum had skewed. The sheriff, who always liked the assurance of a town's collective voice, felt it shift under his feet. Jacob did not become a saint that day. He did not win everyone's good graces. But something odd and radical happened. The townspeople were forced to reckon with the fact that their cruelty had costs, and that a woman like Liza Hart could cut through the pretense they had relied on to sleep easy at night. Jacob was not led away. The sheriff, pressed by the uncomfortable presence of a woman whose life he had watched with his own small private witness, decided to file the papers and say he would look into their truth. It was a soldier's retreat that kept violence at bay. Afterward, in the hush that followed like a benediction, Jacob and Liza sat on the saloon's back steps. He took off his hat as if it were an offering, and the lantern's flicker touched the side of his face like an apostle's sheen. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His eyes said, "Thank you, and I owe you everything, but I'd rather hold the debt in a place that didn't make the town uncomfortable." "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. but in the way he said it you could tell he'd been thinking of it for a long time. "There's no such thing as a small courage," she replied. "Not when it's the only thing standing between a person and being broken." He looked at her then like someone who had found a rock in the middle of a river that could bear weight. He touched her knuckles and the contact was quiet, an exchange of small, meaningful facts. "Darlin, this hat comes off only for you," he hummed, then leaned forward and kissed her. It was a simple kiss, the kind that tastes like salt and coffee and 1,000 steady mornings. It was not a blaze but a lantern lit, persistent, warming, a thing you come back to. They did not rush into the sort of partnership that novels make easy. They moved in a cautious choreography of two people who had long practiced carrying life alone. Jacob began to stake out his days more formally in Miller's Bend. He helped in ways that could not be watched with cruel eyes and made a quiet claim on the land he lived in. Mending fences, helping the farmers with their horses, and repairing the roof of the church. Liza, who had been content with small victories, found herself letting down a corner of armor every so often to reveal the lighter parts of herself that had been secreted away like captured birds. Rumors did not vanish overnight. Gossip in a town is the bread of daily life. It must be chewed up and swallowed to make room for new things. But something else had come into existence along with their tenderness. A truth that cannot be entirely smothered. People began to measure the town's worth by the way it treated the quiet. They watched Jacob not as a villain but as a man who stood for something better. They watched Liza not as a target but as someone who had earned a seat at the table. It didn't make them the center of everyone's world. Jeanette kept her small grudge. The cattlemen rode out and sometimes returned with the kind of swagger that suggested they had not learned. But the town's edge changed enough that the worst of the cruelties found less fertile soil. The small, steady things that had built a home for Liza and Jacob, the mutual tending, the washing and the mending, the way Jacob would come in and make a fire for her when the nights turned cold, grew into something that felt like an anchor. They married in a small ceremony at the church with the preacher's reluctance eased by the practical fact of two people buying a shared broom. The townspeople attended mostly out of habit and curiosity, and the piano struck an honest, if old-fashioned, tune. Liza wore a new bonnet that she had mended herself and Jacob took off his hat at the altar the way he had once said he would do for no one. He tilted his head then and kissed her under the lantern's modest light, and for a moment the town's smallness seemed not a thing to crush but to be woven into a tapestry of something more tender. There were challenges still. A winter came, hard and bright, that tested the town's patience and their roofs alike. One night a fever found its way through the town like a thief, stealing warmth from chests and leaving coughs for the walls. Liza spent nights tending to the sick, her hands moving like prayer. The kettle had a constant boil and Jacob worked with a kind of quiet fury to keep the town from losing ground. They both gave more than they had some nights. Liza's hands grew raw and Jacob's face grew thinner. But the town had begun to notice the small, cumulative work they had done over seasons. People brought in baked goods and blankets, and even Jeanette softened, her sermon softened by the sound of human need. Months later, when spring had bled into a green that pulled the town out of its dusty skin, there came the sort of small miracle that towns sometimes call redemption and that people in hard places simply take as a fact of survival. A child, the one Liza had helped months earlier, Maggie, recovered enough to run again, her freckles brighter as if the sun had agreed to paint them. Her mother stood in the doorway of the Iron Horse and thanked Liza with a voice that shook and was unprepared for the rest of the gratitude Jacob gave by simply standing nearby, hat off like an ordinary sign of respect. The town learned, slowly and not without error, that when people like Liza and Jacob step forward without a plea, something in the community begins to mend. They begin to see that pity and charity are not the same as justice. They begin to notice how the world can be changed by small, steady acts of courage. Liza and Jacob did not imagine their life as a Sunday sermon about virtue. They did not bow to the idea that their tenderness would be a cure for all that preceded them. They were stubborn people with simple aims. Tend, love, and keep the small bright things from dying. There were quiet mornings when Jacob rode out and returned with a wildflower in his coat. There were afternoons when Liza would stand in the doorway and let the wind dry her apron and her hair, looking like some plain, noble figure. They made a life together that fit like a pair of old boots, comfortable and not showy. Years later, sitting on a porch that had seen both dust and rain, they would watch the town and see how things had softened. People treated the quiet with less disdain, and children grew up without learning cruelty as their first language. The preacher's wife, Jeanette, whose hatred had been a kind of self-made gospel for so long, took to sitting on the church steps sometimes and knitting. She never admitted that she had been wrong in any wholesale way, but she had become the sort of woman who had pockets full of mended things and a gossip that had the good sense to include people's kindnesses among the sins she liked to enumerate. One evening, after the saloon had closed and the moon was a silver coin in the sky, Liza and Jacob stood outside the Iron Horse, sharing a tin mug of coffee left over from closing. The wind moved through the town like a hand smoothing creases. Jacob's hat was on his head, though not pulled down. He leaned forward and murmured the small thing that had become a private joke and a public truth. "Darlin, this hat comes off only for you," he said then, and the world seemed to agree. He reached out and touched her face lightly, the sort of gesture so small it might have been missed if you weren't watching the honest parts of people. He kissed her again under the flicker of the lantern, a kiss that tasted of coffee and the smoke of a stove and the quiet that happens when two people choose each other beyond spectacle and judgment. It was a kiss that was equal parts recognition and promise. It was not the end of their story. Stories like theirs never have dramatic closings, but the sound of a life made steady in the face of a town that had tried to make them small. They would grow old in Miller's Bend, marked by the little lines of work and care on their faces. They would watch horses brought in by boys who had once been the kind of men who shouted their cruelty like flags. They would live through winters that made the town buckle and summers that made it bloom. They would hold small feasts, and sometimes sit in silence watching the stars as if deciding which ones they deserved. In the quiet places of their life, they would tell each other the kind of stories you only tell once a life has been long enough to make them true. The time Jacob first saw Liza in the saloon and how her silence was its own kind of dignity. The time Liza's patience had fixed a neighbor's ruin. The nights when they had had nothing but a kettle and each other and that had been enough. If you were to pass through Miller's Bend now, years after the first small fight had ruffled its easy surface, you would notice small changes. You would notice the porch rails were painted a cheerful blue. The saloon's door hung a little straighter. The piano had more careful wear on its keys because people had learned to play it not to drown sorrow but to make space for conversation. Liza would still stand at the back door of the Iron Horse sometimes and look out at the road, hands busy, eyes slow as horizons. Jacob would still tip his hat in the morning, but the hat would not be an apology. It would be a signal of belonging. And beneath it, Jacob would always keep his hair a little rough and his mind a little ready for trouble, because some things don't leave you. But when he took the hat off, he would do it now at her request first and at the church's council later. He would take it off because it felt like the right thing in front of a woman who had carried more than she'd shown. The town learned the way small places learn by repetition. People began, without any dramatic ritual, to treat quiet women with a gentler breath. They began to keep their tongues for stories that needed to be told and not for stale amusements that came at the cost of someone's dignity. That is the small, durable change that Liza and Jacob left in Miller's Bend. Not a new law or a monument, but a simple, human recalibration. Years later, when Jacob and Liza sat on the porch with a blanket between them and their hands knotted like a well-worn rope, a child might pass by and ask about them. "Ain't you folks the ones who made a place kinder?" the child might say. And someone else might nod because people learn history in the small ways it gets handed down. Not as grand gestures but as habits of heart. If you saw yourself in Liza, if her story hit you like a small stone in the shoe of your life, remember this: some roots grow in silence. They do not need the world to watch them to do their work. They grow because someone waters them every day. And sometimes, rare and blessed, someone comes and stands in the doorway and shares the water. There is a tenderness to towns like Miller's Bend that you have to look for, and sometimes you have to make a very small noise to find it. Liza found it not by making noise but by being steadfast. Jacob found it not by making a show but by removing his hat and showing that he had the courage to be simple. They were not heroes in the way newspapers print heroes. They were people who decided to do ordinary things with uncommon decency. And that's how a whisper changed a town.